Between September 18th and 20th, 1982, 12 people were eliminated across the remote sawgrass channels of Collier County, Florida, in what would become known as the Everglades territory killings, all adults, all members of the same family operation. The method was surgical, rifle shots from concealed positions in cypress hammocks, ambushes on dark water channels, bodies weighted and sunk where alligators gathered thick. The perpetrators weren't rival poaching gangs or federal agents. They were 5 members of the Decker family, a father and his 4 sons moving through the swamp like ghosts, methodically erasing everyone who'd crossed into territory their great-grandfather had claimed. In 1923, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement would later call it one of the most calculated eliminations in Everglades history. But the motive wasn't drugs, wasn't organized crime, wasn't even a blood feud passed down through generations. It was 600 acres of prime alligator hunting ground that had been in the Decker family for 59 years, invaded by men they'd warned away. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. The discovery came at dawn on September 22nd. Thomas Brennan, a 41-year-old Florida Fish and Wildlife officer conducting routine patrol through the Turner's Hammock region, found the first body floating in a channel where cypress knees broke the surface like skeletal fingers. Daniel Miller, 18 years old, had surfaced after 2 days underwater. The chains meant to keep him down had slipped. The alligators hadn't finished their work. What Brennan saw in that green-brown water, backlit by morning sun filtering through Spanish moss, would wake him up at night for the rest of his career. He radioed for backup at 6:47 a.m., his voice shaking despite 20 years of finding bodies in Florida swamps. By noon, every available Collier County Sheriff's deputy was searching the channels. By evening, they'd found 3 more bodies in various states of decomposition and animal predation. Divers went down in water so dark their lights barely penetrated 3 feet. They found more. The final count took a week of searching 2,025 square miles of wetland. 12 dead. All members of the Miller family, from Immokalee, all killed by high-powered rifle rounds, all disposed of in Everglades water, all within what everyone in the swamp community knew as Decker territory, though no government map showed any such boundary. Collier County sprawled across 2,025 square miles of southwestern Florida in 1982, where the developed coastline gave way to wilderness that looked much as it had when the Calusa Indians had hunted there 500 years before. The county stretched from the Gulf of Mexico beaches, where Naples was beginning its transformation into a retirement paradise for wealthy northerners, back into the interior Everglades, where communities like Copeland, Jerome, and Ochapi existed as scattered outposts of old Florida cracker culture. Population stood around 85,000 for the entire county, but only 2,000 souls lived in the deep swamp settlements where the Deckers made their home. Most folks in the interior had never been farther than Fort Myers, 60 miles north, and many went months without seeing anyone outside their immediate family and neighbors. The Everglades themselves defied easy description. Not quite land, not quite water, but something in between. Sawgrass prairies stretched for miles, broken by cypress domes and hardwood hammocks that rose like islands from the marsh. Channels wound through the grass, some deep enough for boats, others barely ankle deep, but treacherous with hidden holes and quick mud. Alligators gathered in these channels by the dozens during dry season, stacked like cordwood in the deeper pools waiting for rain. The water ran dark as tea, from tannins leached from cypress roots, and it smelled like earth and rot and something older than memory. September in the Everglades meant the tail end of wet season. Temperatures hit 88 degrees by mid-afternoon, dropping only to 76 at night. The air so humid you could feel it in your lungs with every breath. Afternoon thunderstorms rolled through most days around 3 p.m., turning channels into torrents for 20 minutes before moving on. The smell was layered: wood smoke from cook fires and burn piles, the sweet decay of vegetation composting in standing water, the metallic tang of tannin-rich streams, and underneath it all that particular scent of brackish water where fresh met salt 40 miles from the Gulf. At night, when temperatures dropped just slightly and fog began rising from warm water meeting cooling air, you could hear the swamp settling into its nocturnal rhythms. Bull alligators bellowing their territorial claims, great blue herons screaming, the distant whine of mosquito swarms so thick they sounded like distant engines. Sound traveled strangely in the Everglades. Sometimes you'd hear an airboat motor 5 miles away, clear as if it were beside you. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you through the sawgrass. Raymond Michael Decker was 58 years old that September, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6 feet tall, but his frame had been carved lean by 6 decades of physical labor in subtropical heat, all ropey muscle and prominent bone structure with no spare flesh anywhere. His skin was the color and texture of old leather, tanned dark brown from a lifetime under Florida sun, with deep creases radiating from his eyes and mouth like cracks in dried earth. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from breaks that had never been set properly, fingers scarred from countless gator bites and knife slips. He was missing the tip of his left pinky finger from the second knuckle up, taken by a snapping turtle in 1961. A long scar ran down his right forearm, pale against the dark skin, souvenir from a machete that had slipped while he was cutting through palmetto scrub in '59. Another scar, this one curved and raised, traced his left jaw from ear to chin, legacy of a bar fight in 1953 that had required 32 stitches and left him unconscious for 2 days. Every morning, Raymond woke at 4:45 in the stilted cypress wood house his grandfather had built in 1923, on a hammock 3 miles back from the nearest road. The house sat 8 feet off the ground on creosote pilings, built high to survive the floods that came every few years when hurricanes pushed Gulf water inland. He'd make coffee in a battered aluminum percolator on a propane stove, the same percolator his mother had used, dented, and discolored, but still functional. He'd pour that coffee, strong enough to dissolve a spoon, into a chipped ceramic mug and carry it out to the screened porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the house. There, as the sky shifted from black to deep blue to the pale orange of dawn, he'd sit in a cane-bottom chair his father had woven in '47, smoke hand-rolled cigarettes made from Prince Albert tobacco, and watch the fog burn off the sawgrass marsh that stretched to the horizon in 3 directions. He didn't talk in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee so strong it could strip paint, and thought about the day ahead. By 5:30, he'd be moving, checking the traps and lines, hidden 2 miles back in territory only he and his sons knew how to navigate, following trails that existed in memory rather than on any ground you could see. What Raymond valued most wasn't money, though God knew the Deckers needed every dollar they could pull from the swamp. What he valued, what kept him working at 58 when most men his age were broken or dead, was the 600 acres of prime Everglades hunting ground his great-grandfather Elijah Decker had claimed in 1923, before Florida was fully mapped, before the government cared about wetlands, before tourists knew the Everglades existed as anything more than a dangerous swamp to be drained and developed. This territory, a network of deep channels, cypress sloughs, and sawgrass islands where alligators gathered thick during dry season, had sustained 4 generations of Deckers. It represented everything the family had ever built, the only inheritance Raymond could pass to his sons in a world that offered men like him nothing else. Elijah Decker had come to Florida from Georgia in 1922, running from debts and looking for opportunity in a state that was still frontier in all but name. He'd pushed into the Everglades when most white settlers stayed on the coast, learned to read the water in the land, found the channels where gators nested and the hammocks that stayed dry even in flood season. He'd claimed his territory the old way, by working it, by being there first, by defending it when others tried to move in. There were no deeds, no surveys, no government recognition, just presence, knowledge, and the willingness to fight for what was yours. Elijah had taught Raymond's grandfather, Joseph. Joseph had taught Raymond's father, Michael. Michael had taught Raymond. And Raymond had taught his sons, Raymond Jr., Thomas, William, and Joseph. 4 generations of knowledge passed down: how to read Gator sign, where channels ran deep, which hammocks flooded and which stayed dry, when to harvest, and when to let the animals breed. The territory wasn't just valuable economically, though the alligator hides and meat, pulled from those 600 acres, had fed the Decker family through the Depression, through World War II, through every economic catastrophe the 20th century had thrown at rural Florida. It was identity. In swamp communities where land ownership was fluid and government maps meant nothing, territory was claimed by presence, by work, by blood. Everyone in Collier County who worked the Everglades knew that stretch of swamp from Turner's Hammock east to Cypress Bend, from the deep channel they called Black Run North to the Sawgrass Flats near Jerome, belonged to the Deckers. The boundaries weren't marked with fences or signs, but with knowledge that outsiders didn't possess. Frank Eugene Miller was 42 years old that September, built thick and strong from 20 years of construction work before the recession of 1981 had killed the building industry across southwestern Florida. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, barrel-chested, with massive forearms and hands calloused from hammer and saw work. His face was sunburned and deeply lined despite his relative youth, weathered by outdoor labor and worry about money that never quite stretched far enough. He'd been laid off in March of '81 when the development company he'd worked for went bankrupt, owing him $4,000 in back wages he'd never see. He'd spent a year taking odd jobs, roofing work when he could find it, day labor at farms, anything to keep his family housed and fed. By summer of '82, he was desperate enough to listen when his cousin Jerry mentioned that alligator hunting could bring in serious money if you knew where to look and had the stomach for hard work in difficult conditions. Frank brought his 3 brothers into the venture. David Miller, 39, had worked the same construction crews as Frank until the layoffs. Carl Miller, 37, had been driving trucks until diesel prices made the margins too thin and his company cut half its drivers. Robert Miller, 35, had tried running a small engine repair shop that had failed when people stopped having money to fix their lawnmowers and chainsaws. The 4 brothers were broke, not lazy, desperate, not criminal. They pooled their remaining cash, bought the state licenses required for legal alligator harvest, studied the regulations, purchased used equipment at prices that seemed reasonable but still hurt. They brought their sons, young men in their late teens and early 20s, who'd grown up in Immokalee, watching opportunities disappear as agriculture mechanized and packing houses closed. Frank's sons were Michael, 21, and Christopher, 19. David had one son, James, 22. Carl had 2 boys, Matthew, 20, and Daniel, 18. Robert had 3 sons, Kevin, 23, Brandon, 21, and Thomas, 24. 12 men, total, 3 generations, all looking at the Everglades as salvation from poverty that had ground them down month by month. They weren't bad men. They were broke men. The distinction mattered, though it wouldn't save them. They'd obtained proper state permits, followed the regulations as they understood them, believed they were operating within the law. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, coming from inland Immokalee, where the culture was agricultural rather than swamp-based, was that government permits meant nothing against 60 years of territorial code that predated any state authority. September 7th, 1982. A Tuesday afternoon, when the temperature had climbed to 91 degrees and humidity made the air feel thick as wet wool, Raymond Decker and his 4 sons confronted the Miller group at Turner's Hammock, a raised island of live oak and cabbage palm about 3 acres in size, where the Millers had pulled their boats to rest during the midday heat. The meeting was tense from the first moment, but not violent. Not yet. Raymond kept his hands visible, his voice level. He'd brought his sons as show of strength, not aggression. Raymond Jr. stood to his right, 34 years, old and built like his father, but heavier through the shoulders. Thomas was 32, quieter than his older brother with their mother's dark eyes. William was 29, the tallest of the boys, at 6 feet 3 inches. Joseph was 26, the youngest, still trying to figure out who he was beyond being a Decker. Raymond explained, his voice respectful at first, that this territory had been worked by his family since before Florida had been a state in any meaningful sense. His great-grandfather had claimed it in 1923. 3 generations had lived off this water. The boundaries might not appear on any government map, but everyone who worked the Everglades in Collier County knew this was Decker territory. Always had been. The Millers had permits, sure, and Raymond wasn't questioning the legality of those permits. But legal and right weren't always the same thing. This was Decker water. Had been for 59 years. He was asking them, respectfully, to work somewhere else. Frank Miller's response was polite but firm, delivered in a voice that carried the frustration of a man who'd tried everything else and found this one possibility. He wasn't willing to surrender. They had state licenses, he said. Paid good money for them. According to the government, this was public land, open to anyone with proper permits. They weren't looking for trouble with the Deckers or anyone else. They just needed to work, needed to feed their families, same as everyone. There were enough alligators in the Everglades for everyone. The swamp was big, no reason they couldn't share it. Raymond tried again, his voice harder now, the respect thinning. He offered to show them other territory, virgin swamp to the south that nobody had claimed, where gators gathered just as thick and the hunting would be just as good. He'd mark it out for them personally, show them the channels, help them get started. All he asked in return was that they respect his family's ground, leave the Decker territory alone. The Millers refused. They'd already scouted this area, Frank said. Spent 2 weeks learning the channels, finding the gator holes, setting their patterns. They weren't starting over somewhere else. They were staying. The law was on their side. If the Deckers had a problem with that, they could take it up with Fish and Wildlife or the sheriff. Raymond didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch from 10 p.m. until 3:30 in the morning, smoking cigarettes rolled so tight they lasted 15 minutes each, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours before, watching the darkness where the swamp began and his yard ended. Clara, his wife of 35 years, came out twice to ask if he was coming to bed. Both times he shook his head without speaking. She knew that look, had seen it maybe 3 times in their marriage. The last time had been in 1976 when a man from Naples had tried to buy Decker territory from the county, claiming it was abandoned state land. That situation had ended with the man withdrawing his claim after his boat had sunk in a channel, and he'd spent 8 hours, waist deep in water, surrounded by alligators, before being rescued. The man had left Florida the next week. Nobody could prove anything, but everyone knew. Raymond's justification formed slowly through those dark hours, building like thunderheads on a summer afternoon. He wasn't a violent man by nature or preference. He'd been in his share of fights, sure, everyone who lived in the swamp had, but he didn't seek conflict. What he was, what his father had raised him to be, was a man of principle. In the Everglades, you didn't take what wasn't yours. The government might not recognize family territory, might issue permits like they meant something, but the swamp recognized it. Every gator hunter in Collier County knew the Deckers owned that water the way you own something through blood and work and generations. The Millers knew it too now. They'd been told directly, respectfully, given options and alternatives. Their refusal wasn't ignorance anymore. It was disrespect. It was a challenge to everything the Decker name meant. He thought about Elijah, his great-grandfather who'd claimed this territory when Florida was still wild, who'd fought off claim jumpers and poachers, who'd understood that in frontier country you defended what was yours, or you lost it. He thought about his grandfather Joseph, who'd maintained those boundaries through the Depression when desperate men tried to take everything that wasn't nailed down. He thought about his father Michael, who'd taught Raymond that legacy mattered more than money, that what you passed to your sons defined what kind of man you'd been. All of them had defended this territory when it was threatened. That's what men did. That's what fathers did. You protected what was yours, passed it intact to the next generation. If he backed down now, if he let outsiders take what 4 generations had built and maintained, what would he tell his sons? What kind of man would that make him? What kind of father? Over the next 10 days, from September 8th through September 17th, the Deckers watched the Millers with patience, learned from hunting animals that moved on schedules, measured in seasons rather than hours. Raymond and his sons took turns, never obvious, never close enough to seem threatening, just present in the swamp going about their normal work while noting everything the Miller family did. They learned patterns. The Millers launched their boats from the public ramp at Copeland every morning between 5:45 and 6:15, depending on how long it took 12 men to get organized. They worked in groups, never all together, usually splitting into teams of 3 or 4. They checked trap lines set the previous day, reset them, moved to new areas. They were methodical despite their inexperience, working hard, trying to maximize every hour on the water. They usually pulled out by 2 p.m. before the afternoon storms rolled through, loading their boats onto trailers and driving back to Immokalee in a convoy of 3 pickup trucks. Raymond planned with the same methodical patience. The swamp was their ally, his and his sons, in ways the Millers couldn't understand with only 2 weeks' experience. The Deckers knew every channel, every hammock, every deep hole and shallow flat across 600 acres. They'd worked for generations. They knew where water ran deep enough to hide a body weighted with chain 15 feet or more, dark enough that even in daylight you couldn't see 3 feet down. They knew where alligators gathered thickest, the feeding zones where a bull gator would take anything that hit the water. They knew which islands flooded during storms, which paths through sawgrass wound into dead ends, which channels had currents strong enough to carry things away toward the Gulf, 40 miles distant. Weapons weren't a problem. They owned the same rifles they'd always owned, used for hunting hogs and deer, for protecting livestock from panthers and black bears. Raymond had a .30-30 Winchester he'd bought in 1957. Raymond Jr. favored a .308 Remington. Thomas used their father's old .30-06, scope slightly crooked but still accurate. William and Joseph both had Marlins in .30-30 caliber. Nothing special, nothing that would draw attention. Hunting rifles owned by half the men in rural Florida. They had machetes for cutting through palmetto scrub, 20 feet of heavy chain for each boat, cotton rope that wouldn't float. They had knowledge, patience, and justification they'd built over 10 days of watching their territory being violated. September 18th, 1982. A Saturday. The Millers worked later than usual, setting overnight lines they planned to check at first light Sunday. By 6:45 p.m., most of them had left the swamp, boats loaded onto trailers, heading home to Immokalee. But Frank Miller's 2 sons, Michael and Christopher, had volunteered to stay overnight on a hammock 2.5 miles into the swamp, watching the lines, ready to check them at dawn before the others arrived. They thought it would give them an advantage, maximize their harvest time. They were young, enthusiastic, still believed hard work and early starts could overcome anything. They'd camped on a raised hammock called Bird Island, 3 acres of live oak and palm, dry ground even in flood season. They'd built a fire, not large but visible, a point of light in the darkness. They had a cooler full of sandwiches and beer, a transistor radio playing country music from Fort Myers, sleeping bags rated for temperatures that never actually occurred in September in Florida. By 7:45 p.m., full darkness had fallen. The sun dropped fast in the Everglades, no mountains or hills to create twilight, just daylight and then sudden night. The Decker boats moved through the channels silent as shadows. Raymond and Raymond Jr. in one flat-bottom boat, Thomas and William in another. They used push poles instead of motors, standing in the boats and driving the poles into the mud bottom, propelling themselves forward without sound, beyond the whisper of water against aluminum hull. They'd done this 1,000 times, knew how to move through darkness using nothing but memory and feel. The swamp sounds covered what little noise they made: bull gators bellowing, night birds calling, wind moving through sawgrass, the background chorus of frogs and insects that rose to near deafening levels after sunset. 8:32 p.m. The Deckers were in position, 2 boats 30 yards apart, both with clear sight lines to the fire on Bird Island. Raymond could see the Miller boys clearly, silhouetted against the flames. Michael was taller, moving around the fire, gesturing while he talked. Christopher sat on a log drinking beer, laughing at something his brother said. They looked happy, excited, young men who thought they'd figured out a way to save their family from poverty. They had no idea they were being watched, that 4 rifles were being aimed with professional care, that their lives were being measured in the seconds it would take to close fingers on triggers. 8:43 p.m. Raymond fired first, the crack of the .30 sharp across the water, but not unusual. Hunters shot at night sometimes, taking hogs. Michael Miller dropped instantly, center mass, shot at 30 yards, dead before his brain could process what had happened. Christopher jumped up, confused, looking toward where his brother had fallen. Thomas's .308 took him in the chest, spinning him sideways into the fire. He rolled out, made it 3 feet, before a second shot from Raymond Jr.'s Remington caught him in the back. Both boys down within 20 seconds. September 19th, 1982. Sunday. Morning broke hot and clear. Temperature already 79 degrees by 6:30 a.m. when the remaining Millers gathered at the Copeland boat ramp. Frank Miller was annoyed that his sons hadn't returned, weren't answering the air horn signals he'd been blasting since arriving at the ramp. He assumed they'd overslept, or the radio batteries had died. Boys being boys, irresponsible but not in danger. He'd give them hell when he found them. The other Millers, David, Carl, Robert, and their sons, launched their boats and headed into the swamp. The plan was to check the overnight lines Michael and Christopher had been watching, collect whatever gators had taken the bait, reset everything for the following day. They split into 2 groups. 6 men, Frank, David, Carl, James, Matthew, and Daniel, headed north toward the channels near Turner's Hammock. 4 men, Robert and his 3 sons Kevin, Brandon, and Thomas, headed south toward Cypress Bend, where they'd set lines 2 days before. The southern group was smaller, easier to track, isolated from help, Raymond and his sons had positioned themselves before dawn, watching from hammocks a quarter-mile apart, waiting to see which direction the Millers would move. When Robert's boat turned south, the Deckers moved to intercept. They knew exactly where the Miller lines were, had watched them being set, knew the route Robert would take. They let the Millers get 3 miles deep into territory where channels narrowed and sawgrass grew 8 feet high, where sound wouldn't carry far and nobody would hear anything unusual. 7:28 p.m., sunset approaching, the sky turning orange and purple over the sawgrass prairie. Robert Miller and his 3 sons pulled their airboat onto a hammock locals called Gator Point, planning to camp overnight same as Michael and Christopher had done. They were increasingly nervous now. All day they'd found no sign of Frank's boys, no response to signals, nothing but empty channels and untouched trap lines. Something felt wrong. The swamp had a quality to it that evening, too quiet. Even the gators weren't bellowing like they usually did. Kevin Miller, 23 years old, told his father he wanted to leave, head back to Copeland. Something wasn't right. Brandon agreed, 21 and spooked by the silence. Robert, trying to project confidence he didn't feel, said they'd camp here, check the lines at first light, find Michael and Christopher in the morning. Probably just radio problems. 8:17 p.m., deep dusk, the last light fading. The 4 Miller men sat around their small camp. No fire this time. Too nervous for fire. They had flashlights, kept clicking them on and off, sweeping beams across the water. Thomas Miller, 24, kept his rifle across his lap, safety off, finger near the trigger. He'd said maybe 3 times they should leave now, take their chances navigating in darkness rather than staying in the swamp overnight. All 4 Decker sons were positioned in the sawgrass, surrounding the hammock, 25 to 35 yards out, invisible in vegetation, rifles braced against cypress knees for stable shooting. They waited for Raymond's signal, a single sharp whistle that would sound like a bird call to anyone who didn't know better. 8:21 p.m. The whistle. 4 rifles fired within 3 seconds of each other. Robert Miller took the first round. Raymond Jr.'s .308 fell backward off the log he'd been sitting on. Kevin started to run, made it 4 steps before Thomas Decker's shot caught him. Brandon tried to grab his rifle, died reaching for it when William's bullet punched through his ribs. Thomas Miller got his rifle up, actually fired 2 wild shots toward the muzzle flash he'd seen before Joseph Decker's round hit him in the throat. All 4 down in 15 seconds. Clinical, professional, no suffering beyond the brief moment of impact. The Deckers moved in, checked bodies, finished. Anyone still breathing with close-range headshots. Professional, thorough, final. September 20th, 1982, Monday morning. Frank Miller, David Miller, Carl Miller, and their 4 remaining sons, James, Matthew, Daniel, and Frank Jr., whom nobody had mentioned before, but who'd been working the Northern Territory, gathered at the Copeland ramp at 5:30 a.m. 8 family members missing. Michael and Christopher hadn't returned Saturday night. Robert and his 3 sons hadn't returned Sunday night. No bodies, no boats found, no signs of struggle, just gone. Vanished into 2,000 square miles of sawgrass and cypress swamp that could hide anything. Frank had called the Collier County Sheriff's Office at 11 p.m. Sunday night. They'd promised to send someone out Monday morning, told him people got lost in the Everglades all the time, usually turned up fine. But Frank knew. Looking at his brother David's face, at Carl's eyes, he knew. They all knew. The Deckers had to be. But knowing and proving were different things, and admitting they'd been warned off, claimed territory, meant admitting they'd ignored swamp code that everyone understood even if the law didn't recognize it. The 6 remaining Millers made a decision born of desperation and grief and rage that overrode common sense. One last trip into the swamp. They'd search for their family themselves, armed this time. All 6 carrying rifles or shotguns, prepared for trouble if it came. They knew it was dangerous. They suspected what they'd find or wouldn't find. But these were their brothers, their sons, their nephews. They couldn't just wait for the sheriff's department to conduct a search that might take weeks. They had to know. They launched at 6:15 a.m. 3 boats, motors running full throttle, the sound echoing across the marsh, announcing their presence to anyone listening. They headed straight for Decker territory, toward Turner's Hammock, and the channels where they'd last seen their family. Raymond Decker had expected exactly this. Desperation made people predictable. Grief made them stupid. He'd spent Sunday night and Monday morning preparing. His sons were positioned across a 300-yard front along a cypress hammock overlooking the main channel the Millers would have to use. Deep water, 15 feet in the center, flanked by sawgrass too thick to navigate. Anyone coming through had to follow the channel. Perfect ambush geography. The Deckers had 5 rifles, high ground, complete surprise, and the righteous certainty that they were defending what was theirs. The Millers had anger, grief, and the fatal assumption that daylight would protect them. 9:38 a.m. The Miller boats came into view, 3 aluminum boats with outboard motors moving fast, kicking up white water. Frank Miller stood in the lead boat, scanning the channels, calling his sons' names across the empty marsh. The sound of his voice carried clear in the morning air, raw with pain and hope, mixing into something desperate. Behind him, David and Carl's boats followed close. All 6 men were visible, exposed, silhouetted against the morning sun, reflecting off the water. 9:41 a.m. Raymond gave the signal, raised his rifle, and fired. The opening shot hit Frank Miller in the chest, knocked him backward into the boat. Then all 5 Deckers opened fire. Methodical, aimed shots, not panic spraying. The outboard motors died as the men operating them fell. Boats drifted, taking on water from bullet holes punched through aluminum hulls. David Miller returned fire, got off 3 or 4 rounds before Thomas Decker's bullet caught him. Carl tried to dive into the water, thought maybe he could swim, hide in the sawgrass. He made it over the gunwale before 2 rounds hit him, 1 from William, 1 from Joseph. James Miller, Matthew, Daniel, Frank Jr., all dropped within 90 seconds of sustained fire. September 22nd, 1982. Wednesday morning. Thomas Brennan, 41 years old, 20 years with Florida Fish and Wildlife, launched his patrol boat at Turner River at 6 a.m., conducting routine checks of the area following reports of missing hunters. The sheriff's department had asked Fish and Wildlife to assist in the search for the Miller family. 8 men missing since the weekend. Brennan had worked these channels for 2 decades, knew the Everglades as well as any government employee could. He also knew the Deckers, knew their reputation, knew the unspoken territorial boundaries that crisscrossed the swamp, regardless of what any map showed. When he'd heard the missing men were from Immokalee and had been working Decker territory, he'd felt a cold certainty about what he'd find. 6:47 a.m. He found the first body in a channel half a mile east of Turner's Hammock. Daniel Miller, 18 years old, floating face down in dark water, chains wrapped around his torso but slipped, loose enough that gases from decomposition had brought him to the surface. The alligators had been at him. 2 days in warm water had done the rest. Brennan had seen hundreds of bodies in his career. Drowning victims, boating accidents, hunters who'd had heart attacks in the swamp. But something about this one, the bullet hole visible in what remained of the skull, the chains that clearly weren't accidental, the location deep in territory everyone knew belonged to the Deckers, made his hands shake when he reached for his radio. He called the sheriff's office at 6:49 a.m., his voice professionally calm despite the nausea rising in his throat, reporting a body, suspected homicide, requesting immediate backup and the county medical examiner. By noon, Collier County had mobilized every available resource. Sheriff Daniel Crawford, 53 years old, a North Florida native who'd moved to Collier County in 1968, took personal command of the scene. He understood swamp culture, had grown up in similar country near the Okefenokee, knew how territorial codes worked in places where government authority was more theoretical than real. He brought in deputies from Naples, called the state police, requested FBI assistance given the potential body count. By 2 p.m., divers were in the water, searching channels in a grid pattern, finding bodies weighted with chain in 15 feet of dark water. 3 more bodies by evening. The search continued through Wednesday night using spotlights and sonar equipment borrowed from the Coast Guard station in Marco Island. Thursday, September 23rd. 4 more bodies located and recovered. Friday the 24th. 3 more. The final count reached 12 by the following Monday, though recovery took another week as bodies surfaced or were located by divers in increasingly remote channels. 12 members of the Miller family, all adult males, all killed by high-powered rifle rounds, based on preliminary medical examiner reports, all found within a 6-square-mile area that everyone in Collier County's swamp community recognized as Decker territory. The investigation was assigned to FBI Special Agent Patricia Ann Vance, 38 years old, transferred to the Miami field office in 1979 from Chicago, where she'd worked organized crime cases. She'd requested the Everglades assignment specifically, wanting to understand rural Florida culture that seemed as foreign to her as anything she'd encountered in urban gang territory. The Miller case became hers on September 24th when the body count exceeded 10 and interstate implications emerged. Some of the Millers had relatives in Georgia who'd been planning to join the operation. Federal jurisdiction attached. Vance drove to Naples with a team of 6 agents and a forensic specialist, knowing from the beginning this would be the most difficult case of her career. The evidence problems became apparent within 48 hours of starting the investigation. No witnesses to any of the killings. The Everglades covered 2,000 square miles in Collier County alone, most of it accessible only by boat, with visibility limited to a few dozen yards in any direction due to sawgrass and cypress. Nobody had seen anything, or if they had, Swamp code meant they weren't telling federal agents. No murder weapons recovered. The Deckers owned rifles, certainly everyone in rural Florida did, but the weapons had disappeared. Raymond Jr. had driven them to Fort Myers Beach on September 21st, weighted them with chain, and dropped them in 12 feet of Gulf water off a fishing pier. They'd never be found. The Deckers reported the rifles stolen on September 25th, filed a police report claiming someone had broken into their storage shed. The timing was suspicious but not provable. No forensic evidence connecting the Deckers to the crime scenes. Bodies too degraded by water, heat, and animal predation to yield useful trace evidence. Ballistics experts recovered several bullets and fragments from bodies and from trees on various hammocks, determined they came from common hunting calibers, 30-30, 308, 30-06, but without the weapons couldn't match them to specific rifles. The chains used to weight bodies were generic, sold at every hardware store in South Florida, untraceable. What the FBI had was motive, strong and obvious. Territory dispute. The Deckers had worked that swamp for 60 years. The Millers had moved in despite warnings. Opportunity equally clear. The Deckers knew every channel, every hiding spot, could move through that territory in complete darkness. Pattern undeniable. All 12 victims found in Decker territory, killed over a 3-day period in September. And one partial witness. Earl Thomas Simmons, 62 years old, a gator hunter who worked territory adjacent to the Deckers, came forward on September 28th. He told Agent Vance he'd seen Decker boats, recognized them by their distinctive flat-bottom design and the way they sat in the water, in channels near Turner's Hammock on the evening of September 19th. He'd been working his own lines, heard motors, seen the boats in fading light about a quarter-mile distant. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. The Deckers had every right to be in their own territory. But now, knowing when the Millers had died, his testimony placed the Deckers in the area during the killings. It wasn't much, but combined with motive and pattern, it might be enough. The arrests came on October 2nd, 1982. Sheriff Crawford and Agent Vance drove to the Decker homestead at dawn, bringing 12 deputies and 4 FBI agents as backup. They expected resistance, possibly armed. Instead, Raymond Decker was sitting on his porch, drinking coffee like it was any other morning. His 4 sons were inside, sleeping or pretending to sleep. Crawford read the charges: 12 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, federal weapons violations. Raymond said nothing, just set down his coffee cup, stood up, held out his wrists for handcuffs. His sons followed his lead, came out quietly, offered no resistance. Clara Decker watched from the doorway, her face pale, hands gripping the frame like it was the only thing holding her upright. Raymond looked at her once before they put him in the patrol car, nodded. She nodded back. No words, none needed. The trial began February 7th, 1983, in federal court in Fort Myers. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Strand, 46 years old, a career prosecutor who'd handled organized crime cases in South Florida for 15 years. He understood he had a circumstantial case, weak on direct evidence but strong on pattern and motive. His opening statement laid out the territory dispute, the warnings given and ignored, the systematic elimination of 12 men over 3 nights. He presented Earl Simmons's testimony about seeing Decker boats in the area. He brought in fish and wildlife officers who testified about finding bodies in Decker territory, about the chains and weights that indicated deliberate disposal. He had the medical examiner testify about bullet wounds, about the precision of the shots, about the professional nature of the killings. The defense was led by Marcus Andrew Webb, 51 years old, a Naples attorney who'd grown up in the Everglades, whose father had been a gator hunter, who understood swamp culture from the inside. His strategy was straightforward. The evidence was circumstantial. Speculation dressed up as fact. Yes, the Deckers had motive, but motive wasn't proof. Yes, they had opportunity, but so did hundreds of other hunters who worked the Everglades. The bodies found in Decker territory proved nothing except where they'd been dumped, not who'd killed them. Earl Simmons saw boats that might have been Decker boats, but he couldn't swear to it, admitted the light was bad, admitted he'd been a quarter-mile away. The prosecution couldn't produce murder weapons, couldn't place the Deckers at the actual crime scenes, couldn't provide a single witness who'd seen any Decker fire a shot at any Miller. This was tragedy, certainly. 12 men dead, families destroyed. But tragedy didn't equal murder, and suspicion didn't equal proof. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, mostly from coastal Naples, people who worked in tourism and real estate, people who didn't understand swamp culture or territorial codes, deliberated for 4 days. They came back on February 23rd with verdicts. Guilty on all counts. All 5 Deckers convicted of 12 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, federal weapons violations related to the disposal of the rifles. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Clara Decker collapsed in the gallery, caught by her sister before she hit the floor. The Deckers themselves showed no reaction, sat motionless as the judge polled the jury, thanked them for their service, scheduled sentencing for March 15th. Sentencing day. Judge Harold Fleming, 61 years old, appointed to the federal bench in 1975, addressed the courtroom before imposing sentence. He acknowledged the cultural complexities, the territorial codes that governed swamp life, the genuine belief the Deckers might have had that they were defending something that belonged to them. But the law was clear. Territorial codes, however long-standing, didn't supersede federal murder statutes. 12 men had been killed in cold blood, ambushed, executed, their bodies hidden. The planning, the coordination, the systematic nature of the killings all pointed to premeditation of the worst kind. Raymond Decker Sr., life without possibility of parole. Raymond Jr., life without parole. Thomas Decker, life without parole. William Decker, life without parole. Joseph Decker, 40 years, because of his age and lesser role. Clara May Decker lost everything on March 15th, 1983. Her husband, all 4 of her sons, taken in a single afternoon, removed from her life as completely as if they'd died. She was 56 years old, alone in a house built for a family of 7, 3 miles back in swamp country, with no neighbors closer than 2 miles, no income, no prospects, no future she could imagine. The state of Florida had seized the gator hunting equipment as evidence, then auctioned it to pay court costs. The territory her family had defended with 12 lives was worthless to her anyway. She couldn't work it alone, didn't have the strength or the knowledge to run trap lines, process hides, navigate the channels in darkness. The thing they'd killed for was gone the moment they'd been arrested. The community turned against her, not from malice, but from discomfort. She represented tragedy too enormous to acknowledge, violence too close to home, choices that forced people to examine their own beliefs about territory and code and what men should do when threatened. People who'd been friends for 30 years stopped visiting. The phone stopped ringing. At the grocery store in Copeland, people looked away when she walked past, found sudden interest in their shopping lists. She became invisible, a ghost haunting her own life. She tried to maintain the property those first few months, working the small garden she'd always kept, repairing screens damaged by storms, painting the porch railings. But it was too much for one woman in her 50s. The house started deteriorating. Screens tore and stayed torn, paint peeled, boards rotted. The jungle began reclaiming what 60 years of human presence had held back. She wrote letters every week, one to Raymond, one to each of her sons, sent to different prisons across Florida. Rayford State Prison for Raymond Thomas and William, Union Correctional for Raymond Jr., Sumter Correctional for Joseph. Her letters were simple, updates about weather in the house, questions about their health, expressions of love that felt inadequate but were all she could offer. Raymond wrote back every 2 weeks, his handwriting cramped from arthritis that was getting worse in the cold prison, his messages short and practical, never apologized, never expressed regret, just told her he loved her, asked if she needed money, reminded her that what they'd done had been necessary. The territory was worth defending even if the price was everything. His certainty never wavered. Sometimes Clara envied that certainty. Mostly it just made her tired. The Miller family's grief was different, more public, less isolated. Anne Marie Miller, Frank's widow, 40 years old, had lost her husband and both her sons in 3 days. She buried 3 coffins in the Immokalee Cemetery on October 1st, 1982, standing between them, while a pastor she barely knew read scripture about faith and resurrection. Her sister had flown in from North Carolina, stood beside her, held her up when her legs wouldn't work. 200 people attended the funeral. The tragedy had made regional news, brought attention, Anne didn't want but couldn't refuse. David Miller's wife, Sarah, 38, lost her husband and her son, James. She stood at their graveside holding her daughter's hand, her face blank with shock that wouldn't fade for months. Carl Miller's wife, Rebecca, 36, buried her husband and 2 sons. Matthew and Daniel, 3 caskets in the ground before she was 40 years old. Robert Miller's wife, Linda, 34, lost the most. Her husband and 3 sons, Kevin, Brandon, and Thomas. 4 coffins, 4 holes in the earth, 4 lives erased because they'd hunted alligators in the wrong 600 acres of swamp. The children left behind. Those who'd lost fathers and brothers to the Everglades in September of 1982 grew up marked by violence they couldn't fully understand. Michael Miller's girlfriend, Tracy Henderson, 19 years old, was 3 months pregnant when Michael died. She gave birth to a daughter, Melissa Ann Miller, in March of 1983. Melissa grew up in Immokalee, raised by a mother who never remarried, never fully recovered from losing the only man she'd ever loved. Tracy worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses and waitressing, kept Melissa fed and clothed and educated, but the bitterness never left her voice when she talked about the father her daughter would never know. Killed over territory, she'd say, over invisible lines in a swamp, over codes that meant more to men than their own lives. Melissa learned early that her father's death was senseless, preventable, the result of pride and stubbornness on both sides of a dispute that should have been settled with words instead of bullets. Christopher Miller's younger sister, Rebecca Lynn Miller, 14 when her brother died, developed anxiety that manifested in panic attacks whenever she heard certain sounds: airboat motors, gunshots during hunting season. Even the sound of outboard motors on the lakes near Immokalee would send her into spiraling fear, heart racing, breath coming short, convinced something terrible was about to happen. She spent her teenage years in therapy, tried medication that made her numb, stopped the medication, and learned to manage the fear instead. She left Florida at 18, moved to Atlanta, got as far from the Everglades as she could, while staying in the South. She changed her last name legally at 21, became Rebecca Lynn Patterson, tried to erase the connection to a tragedy that had defined her adolescence. The Decker grandchildren, children of Raymond's cousins and extended family who shared the name, even if not the direct bloodline, carried the family name like a mark. In Collier County, in Naples and Copeland and Everglades City, everyone knew what Decker meant. The murder family, the swamp killers. Children at school learned to avoid mentioning the name, not from kindness, but from the discomfort their parents felt. Some of the younger Deckers left Florida entirely, moved to Georgia, Alabama, Texas, places where the name didn't carry history. Others stayed but legally changed their surnames, became Williamson or Jackson or Martin, erasing the connection to Raymond and his sons. A few stayed and kept the name, wore it with defiance, insisted their family had been right to defend what was theirs, that the Millers had brought their deaths upon themselves by ignoring warnings and disrespecting territory. These arguments happened in bars, usually, fueled by alcohol and resentment, and sometimes they led to fights that continued the cycle of violence in smaller, less fatal ways. The Everglades gator hunting industry, already under pressure from environmental regulations and animal rights activism, never recovered its reputation after the Miller killings. The case made national news, appeared on network television news broadcasts, was featured in Time magazine and the Miami Herald. The narrative that emerged in national media, inevitably simplified, painted Florida's commercial gator hunters as violent, territorial, backwards men operating under codes left over from frontier days, dangerous to outsiders and each other. Tourism interests in Naples and Marco Island used the tragedy to argue for stricter regulation of hunting in the Everglades, claiming it was incompatible with the growing tourist economy. Within 5 years, commercial gator hunting permits were restricted to a fraction of previous levels. Within a decade, Most commercial operations had shut down entirely, unable to make economic sense of the new regulations. The lifestyle the Deckers had killed 12 men to protect died anyway, not from violence, but from bureaucracy and changing economics. Raymond Michael Decker Sr. died in Rayford State Prison on August 14, 2001, age 77, from lung cancer that had metastasized to his liver and bones. He'd served 19 years of his life sentence, spent them in general population mostly, a model prisoner who never caused trouble, never complained, followed rules with the same discipline he'd applied to gator hunting. He'd refused chemotherapy when the cancer was diagnosed in 2000, told the prison doctor he'd lived long enough, seen enough. Other inmates respected him, despite knowing what he'd done, or perhaps because of it. He was a man who'd followed his code completely, accepted the consequences without whining. That meant something in prison culture. His obituary in the Naples Daily News was 3 sentences, listed his name, his age, his death, mentioned he was survived by a wife and 4 sons, all incarcerated. No one claimed his body for 5 days. Eventually Clara did, drove to Rayford, signed the papers, transported him back to Collier County in a casket that cost $800 she could barely afford. She buried him in Copeland Cemetery under a simple granite stone she'd purchased years before, knowing this day would come. The inscription read, Raymond Decker Sr., 1924 to 2001. He stood his ground. Raymond Jr. died in Union Correctional Institution on March 3, 2015, age 67. Massive heart attack in the prison yard during exercise period. He was dead before the medical staff reached him. He'd served 33 years, would have served another 20 if he'd lived. Thomas Decker is still alive, 75 years old now, still incarcerated at Rayford, his health failing from diabetes and heart disease. His world shrunk to a cell and a yard, and memories of swamp country he'll never see again. William Decker died in prison on November 19, 2008, age 55, complications from diabetes that had gone undiagnosed too long, treated too late. Joseph Decker, the youngest, was released on April 7, 2022, after serving 40 years of his sentence, every day of it. He's 66 now, living in a halfway house in Tampa, working part-time at a hardware store, refusing all interview requests from true crime podcasters and documentary filmmakers. He won't discuss what happened in September of 1982, won't defend it or condemn it, just says he served his time and wants to be left alone. Clara Mae Decker remained in the stilted house until 2012, long after she should have left, long after the structure was safe for habitation. By then she was 86 years old, moving slowly, her hands crippled by arthritis, her memory starting to slip. The house had deteriorated around her, screens gone, porch sagging, roof leaking in a dozen places. Social services found her during a welfare check, living in 2 rooms of a 6-room house, the rest abandoned to mold and decay. They moved her to a nursing home in Naples, a clean facility with air conditioning and regular meals, and other women her age, who'd also lost their families to violence or time. She died there on February 9th, 2019, age 93, surrounded by strangers who were kind but didn't know her story. Her obituary mentioned her husband and sons, but didn't mention the murders, didn't mention the trial, just said she'd endured great tragedy with dignity and faith. The Decker homestead collapsed during Hurricane Irma in September of 2017. 70-mile-per-hour winds, shredding what termites and rot had weakened. Today, it's just creosote pilings sticking out of the mud, surrounded by mangroves and palmetto scrub reclaiming land that humans had occupied for 94 years. The property was seized by Collier County for 10 years of unpaid back taxes, eventually incorporated into state conservation land as part of Everglades expansion. No one will ever build there again. Local teenagers claim it's haunted, say they hear voices on foggy nights, see lights moving through the sawgrass. Probably just stories, the way humans make meaning from empty places, but maybe not. 42 years have passed since that September in the Florida Everglades, when 12 men died over 600 acres of swamp that nobody owns now, that sits empty and abandoned inside conservation boundaries where hunting is prohibited and tourist airboats aren't permitted. The world Raymond Decker tried to protect through violence doesn't exist anymore. It didn't die from his actions, didn't die from the trial or the convictions. It died from time, from development spreading inland from the coast, from economic forces that made tourist dollars more valuable than gator hides, from cultural evolution that erased the codes and traditions Raymond's great-grandfather had brought from frontier Georgia in 1922. Within 20 years of the killings, commercial gator hunting was essentially extinct in Collier County. The young people left for cities, for jobs with air conditioning and steady paychecks. The old people died with their knowledge and their codes, buried in small cemeteries that are themselves being reclaimed by jungle. FBI Special Agent Patricia Vance, who built the case against the Deckers, retired from the Bureau in 2005 after 33 years of service. In a 2018 interview for a true crime podcast called Swamp Justice, she reflected on the case that had defined the middle of her career. Legally, the Deckers were mass murderers, she said. 12 counts of first-degree murder, premeditated, executed with planning and coordination. No question about their guilt. But morally, it's more complicated than that. They were the last generation of a dying culture, trying to defend something that modern law doesn't even recognize as property. Territorial rights based on 60 years of presence and work, generational knowledge passed down, identity tied to land in ways our legal system has no framework for protecting. The law is absolutely clear. But morality, that's messier. I've lived with that contradiction for 40 years. Still don't have a clean answer. Sheriff Daniel Crawford, who arrested the Deckers and testified at their trial, retired in 1995 after 27 years with Collier County Sheriff's Department. He died in 2009, age 80, from complications of emphysema. His son found unpublished memoirs in his father's desk, 70 pages of handwritten reflections on cases and choices. About the Decker case, Crawford had written, Raymond Decker and his boys eliminated 12 men in cold blood over a 3-day period. That's evil by any legal definition. But those 12 men crossed a boundary that had existed for 60 years, ignored multiple warnings, violated a code they absolutely knew was real, even if the government didn't recognize it. The Millers thought state permits gave them rights that superseded generational territory. They were wrong, and it cost them everything. Does that excuse mass murder? No. but it explains it. An explanation isn't the same as justification, though sometimes the line between them gets real thin when you're talking about men defending what they believe is theirs. I arrested them, testified against them, would do it again. But I understood why they did it, even while knowing it was wrong. That contradiction is something I carried to my grave. The Decker case has no heroes. It has a father who valued territorial tradition and family legacy more than 12 human lives, who made a choice to eliminate threats rather than accept loss of status and identity. It has 12 desperate men who made the fatal error of assuming government permits mattered more than swamp code, who ignored warnings because they needed money and thought the law would protect them. It has wives and children on both sides who lost husbands and fathers and brothers to a dispute about boundaries that existed only in collective memory and cultural understanding. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that destroyed rural livelihoods and drove people to desperate measures, a legal framework that couldn't recognize or protect generational territory, law enforcement too understaffed to patrol 2,000 square miles of wilderness, and cultural codes so rigid they demanded blood for trespass. Were the Deckers murderers? Yes. They eliminated 12 people with planning and premeditation, ambushed them in darkness, shot some while they slept, disposed of bodies with calculated efficiency, showed no mercy, offered no quarter. They transformed a territorial dispute into a massacre. Were they also defenders of something real, family legacy, and ancestral territory, and cultural identity in a world that no longer valued those things? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing part of this story because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if someone took what we considered ours, even if the law said it wasn't? How far would we go to protect generational legacy against outsiders who don't understand or respect it? Does justice exist when systems can't protect what communities have valued for decades? Is there a line between defending tradition and committing atrocity? Or does desperation erase that line entirely, leaving only violence and justification? Raymond Decker crossed a boundary no human being should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where generational territory mattered more than government maps, where swamp codes ran deeper than state law, where identity was tied to land in ways modern society no longer recognizes or respects. He chose violence when negotiation failed, chose elimination when compromise was offered, chose to destroy rather than adapt. And in doing so, he destroyed the very thing he was trying to preserve. The territory his great-grandfather had claimed that 4 generations had worked, that he'd killed 12 men to defend, sits empty now, protected by law from the commercial hunting he'd practiced, reclaimed by wilderness, worthless for the purposes he'd valued. He eliminated 12 threats to his heritage and, in the process, destroyed that heritage more completely than any outsider ever could. There's no easy answer here, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where good triumphs and evil is punished. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create desperate people who make desperate choices. And sometimes the line between protecting your heritage and becoming a monster disappears entirely in the fog rolling off cypress water at dawn, leaving only bodies and questions and families destroyed on both sides of an equation that never balanced. 42 years later, the Everglades continues, indifferent to human drama. The swamp that witnessed it all just grows, shifts, adapts, covers scars with new growth. Children kayak through channels where men once hunted each other. Tourists photograph alligators in waters that once hid weighted corpses. Life continues as it always does, relentless and forgetful, covering tragedy with layers of normalcy, until it almost disappears. Almost. But on humid September nights, when fog rolls thick through the sawgrass and bull gators start their territorial bellowing, locals say the swamp remembers. They don't mean ghosts. Nothing so simple, just the weight of choices made, of codes followed to their terrible conclusions, of violence done in the name of honor that dishonored everyone it touched. Revenge doesn't bring back what was stolen. It doesn't preserve tradition or protect legacy. It only creates new wounds, new loss, new families, learning to live with emptiness where love used to be. Raymond Decker defended his family's territory, and in doing so, ensured it would never be hunted again, never be worked again, never fulfill the purpose for which 4 generations had fought. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. At what point does protecting what we love transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? If this story made you think about legacy, territory, and the price we pay when old codes collide with modern law, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about tradition and violence, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when pushed to defend what they believe is theirs. Comment below. What would you have done in Raymond Decker's position? Where do you draw the line between protecting family legacy and losing your humanity in the process? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now, somewhere in forgotten corners, where traditional codes clash with modern systems, and desperate people make choices they can never take back. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One trespassed boundary, one ignored warning, one desperate September night at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law books, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.